Hello ladies and gentlemen, it's the Historical Gamer once again, and today I'm going to be playing Order of Battle Pacific. This is the third part of my actual attack on the island of Java. We've taken the city of Batavia, we've driven east across several important rivers, erecting pontoon bridges as we go, with naval gunfire support on the northern half of the island along the coast, and we have driven to within just a few hexes. You can see on the right edge that Dutch flag with the little gold flag post and the golden star above it there on the far right. That is our final objective point. So we've driven to very close within the final objective point, and we're only 22 out of 40 turns in to this particular battle. The Dutch have put up a splendid little fight so far, with several delaying actions across some of these rivers, but thus far we've been pretty successful in making a speedy advance. We just landed 3 units on the northeast coast. We saw those just a moment ago driving off of the beach, and we've got a force in the southern half of the map as well, which is also advancing swiftly. After a delayed attack, the Australians put up a frustratingly effective defense and seriously delayed our advance to the east, but after breaking through that initial line, there have been fewer spots in the south where the enemies put up too stiff of a resistance. We're just in the process of overcoming their main blocking force, which had about 4 units. 2 or 3 of them were APCs, and once those are reduced, we can move those north to link up with these other guys and take the final Dutch objective point here in this particular battle. That objective point being the city of but the airfield at Kijilap. And I'm sure I'm butchering the pronunciation. I'm sorry, guys. I should probably make sure I pronounce things correctly. But as it is, I've already said it, so I can't undo it, right? I suppose I could edit it out, but now that I'm talking about it, I might as well include it anyway. I mentioned earlier that it is part 3 of my attack on Java. It's actually part 10 of my series on Order of Battle Pacific, and it is a series that I do intend to also swap around and play as the Allied side. Thus far, I've played exclusively as the Imperial Japanese Empire, and once we complete the campaign as the Japanese, we will certainly take a look at the American side. Although, given the pace of which I've been posting these videos, and the fact that I'm reluctant to post videos more than once a day, means that it'll probably be a little bit of time. Also, there's some other games coming out that I want to cover. I don't want this to be exclusively the Order of Battle Pacific channel. I do intend to return to Commander the Great War. I also intend to return to End All Wars. I'd like to return to Buzz Aldrin's Space Program Manager. I just haven't had the time between that and school and everything else going on. In addition to that, I also want to cover Scourge of War Waterloo, which isn't out yet, but is scheduled to come out by by June 11th, in time for the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Waterloo, which is on June 18th of this year. So that's just a little bit over a month away from June 18th and less than a month away now from Scourge of War Waterloo coming out. I've mentioned it a few times before, but I was on the development team for that game. Didn't do anything fancy. I'm not a coder or anything like that, but I did participate as a tester and helped in a few other areas as well. Unfortunately, my talents are lacking when it comes to the ability to actually code, but it was still an amazing experience being part of that whole thing, and I definitely want to make sure we cover that game. But again, full disclosure, as I always do every time I mention that series, obviously I'm biased toward it, so I'm certainly not going to post any reviews. In fact, I don't really post reviews as it is now. I just kind of play through games and tell you my take without a formal review. I don't think it would be right, at least not while a game that I had some hand in creating is about to come out, that I have any kind of critical take on anything. One other thing here real quick, because we'll only see it for a few more seconds, is you can see some of these units over here have these little yellow circles on the very far right bottom of the screen. That indicates that they are low on supply, but not completely out. When a unit has a red circle around near its hit points there, the number 10, for example, to the right of that, when those are red, that means that the unit is totally out of supply. When they're yellow, it means they're in limited supply. So essentially, the reason those units are in limited supply is because I have landed those troops. There wasn't a supply source where they landed, and they're relying strictly on supplies coming in from my destroyers, which are in those adjacent hexes. So essentially, the destroyers are bringing in some supply, but not enough to meet the unit's full needs, which means that the unit does lose some effectiveness, but it is also still partially there. So, as you can see here, we're driving through this last, or most recent anyway, enemy roadblock here on the southern part of the map. In the northern part of the map, we are closing in on that final objective point. Meanwhile, my dive bombers are trying to flee these enemy fighter aircraft. We certainly do not have air superiority, not even close right now over the island of Java. That's one thing I'm a little bit concerned with going forward, is I think that I could run into some trouble in some of the later war scenarios as the Americans start to become more prevalent and they start to replace some of their units with more advanced weaponry like the F-4U Corsair or the P-38 Lightning. Once some of those units start coming in and my Zero fighter planes are no longer the most advanced and highest quality units that I have as far as fighter aircraft, I could start running into some problems maintaining air superiority, and that's going to be a very important factor, especially given the fact that there are certainly going to be some naval engagements that are going to come up where aircraft are going to be involved. And if I can't get my bombers to the ships because they're getting shot down by enemy fighters because we can't maintain any kind of air superiority, we might run into some problems there, especially if we ever get to like a midway scenario or anything like that. So it's a little bit of a concern. I think I might look at possibly buying a Zero fighter if I can save up enough money. It's around 100 coins, where I'm at 61 right now, but the problem is, heavily engaged in combat as I am, it's becoming increasingly difficult to replace all of our losses and save up for any kind of unit. In fact, it's more or less impossible at this point in time. But there you have it. There's the turn situation. One other thing real quick. We're about already almost a third into this video, so this has kind of turned into more of a ramble fest than an actual topic discussion, but I did want to mention this video more than any of the others. Actually, this video really the only one where you're going to see some pretty sluggish performance, where things are a little bit spotty. Units, obviously the frame rates look very poor right now with what you're looking at. That's a known issue with this scenario only. So I was doing a little bit of digging and trying to figure out why I was having poor performance, and in fact I think we're almost out of that point where that's occurring. But I was doing a little bit of digging, and the developers of the game, the Art Aristocrats, the development group who made this game, came out flatly and said, you know, listen, we know there's a bug right now in this scenario. Once a certain Dutch unit engages in combat, frame rates drop. I believe I destroy it, or have just recently destroyed it, so frame rates will improve pretty quick. But once you destroy this one unit, frame rates dramatically drop in this specific scenario. So it's something they're aware of and they're going to fix in a patch, but I didn't want to have to wait a week or 2 weeks or however long it takes for that patch to come out in order to make this video. I've already slowed down my video production more than I would like at this point in this series. So I did play it. I didn't want to just skip ahead because the video quality isn't very good. I wanted to show you guys what happened, even if it didn't look as nice as I would like it to. So just keep that in mind when you're watching this video, because I think the early part of this video, which we're now just a little bit past, is the main part, like kind of right where we're at right now, is the main part where that happens, and then that kind of resolves itself later. I believe the unit I'm actually engaging right now, the Overvelst, or whatever kind of APC that is, I believe that's the type of unit that causes that issue, and once that's destroyed, the issue gets fixed. Now, I don't think it fixes itself until you load a new save, which I kind of did in and out throughout this video. I tried to edit it out as much as possible, but there probably are a few cuts where you see like the options menu come up. I cut a couple of those out, but essentially I wasn't aware at the time I was playing what the issue was, so I didn't realize this wasn't something I could fix by just loading a new save. But things seem to improve a bit later in the scenario, so hopefully that gets better. There you can see I guess that's a good example of the really poor frames right there, is that American artillery unit just destroys our dive bombers, which had landed to escape enemy fighters, only to land apparently in range of enemy artillery pieces, which I didn't even know about. Like I said, the frame issue here should be resolved within the next 2 or 3 minutes, so please bear with me as we kind of go through this. I am intending to keep this video to around 30 minutes, so with that being said, oh wow, we're already 10 minutes in. Last video we talked a lot, we had a historical discussion and talked a lot about Victor Krulak, the Marine general, who ended up being opposed to Vietnam, but not right away. Often he's known as someone who was opposed to the war, or the way it was being fought, the way it was being prosecuted more specifically. However, in his actual early years in Vietnam, he was very much in favor of the attrition strategy and General Westmoreland, frustrating many advisors who tried to convince him that it was folly, only to realize once he was in Vietnam for himself and was there more frequently that his analysis was faulty at best. This video we won't be talking really about any particular historical topics. I don't have anything specifically I want to go over, which is probably why I've gone almost 11 minutes now in just kind of rambling through. But I did want to mention, just kind of talking about some of the tactics and strategies that I'm pursuing very briefly. I suppose now that that period has already really passed. As I was driving east to get to the airfield as quick as we could, obviously we got there, but then my other objective was to secure this town here where I've got those APCs kind of in the center of the map from enemy attacks, because essentially, as we've mentioned multiple times, supplies are everything in this game. You're not going to be successful in this game if you don't protect your supply lines. And I wanted to make sure I didn't advance with my whole force to that city, because while I could have easily taken it much more quickly, I was worried that if I did that, the enemy could move in, and because of the way line of sight works, I might not have even seen it, and just cut my supply by driving north to the coast. More difficult to get that coast road supply line away from me with all that naval gunfire support we have, but while gunfire support is certainly a huge advantage in allowing you to launch successful attacks, it doesn't in of itself destroy units very often, and can take quite a while if you're trying to destroy a unit in order to wear it down to zero because of the way replacements work. So it would have made the enemy vulnerable, but we would have had no way to launch attacks against the enemy because we would have had no troops in the area. And essentially, if they had done that, we would lose this battle because we would run out of time trying to swing back and destroy the enemy units on that supply line. Again, we could bring troops and supplies in through our destroyer transports because of our Tokyo Express specialization. The game, as the campaign goes along, you're given the option to choose between certain attributes which your side has unique to it. So for example, the Japanese can choose the Bushido code, which makes them fight more effectively when they're cut off from supply, or they can kind of choose like some kind of warrior or samurai tradition, which kind of represents the ability to launch bonsai charges, which are very high risk. You lose huge amounts of men. However, you also have a potentially high reward ability to overrun enemy units. The Japanese also have the option for one of their specializations to choose the Tokyo Express. I can't remember what the other one is. You get two choices each time it comes up to having a specialization, and one of them is Tokyo Express, which allows destroyers and cruisers to carry supplies in to troops who might otherwise not have a supply source. Again, but if the enemy cut our river, or our ocean road, I guess you could call it, along here, the northern part of the map, even if they cut that, there's no way that the destroyers would be able to bring in enough supply. Supply is fairly abstract in that you don't control handling convoys and all of that, but units have different supply ratings and how much they can provide and things like that. So again, one destroyer is not going to provide supply for 12 land units. Oh, look at that, a British tank unit. So you can see here we've got kind of three forces, one in the south, one in the kind of northeast around the airfield, and then a north-central kind of force, which is guarding the flank of our attack on the airfield. Looks like the British have some tanks. They're coming up against our forces that are attempting to secure our flank of our airfield attack, and looks like a pretty strong force there of the Dutch and the British. There are two armored units, which I've found that the Japanese armored units are great against infantry. They're not very good against other tanks, which again kind of matches reality. The Japanese didn't have the best tanks during World War II, and that's a bit of an understatement. But it is what it is. Neither did the Allies either at this time. A lot of their tanks were very light as well. It's just seemed that it's been very difficult to effectively deal with the Allied tanks. As you can see here, I'm deploying some more forces that we hadn't deployed yet on the campaign. The only thing we are not deploying is the Hero-class aircraft carrier. We've deployed some Stuart tanks and some infantry, some heavy infantry, to aid our attack in the south a bit. And I'm thinking about maybe purchasing a fighter aircraft as soon as I can. I wanted to go ahead and deploy those guys because, frankly, they're free and there's no reason not to deploy them. And yeah, and the Stuart tank will replace the one tank unit that we just lost. Or did we lose? Did we lose that tank? Yeah, we did lose. No, we didn't. Uh-oh, spoiler alert. Replace a tank unit that I know I'm going to lose, but that's not why I deployed it. Anyway, the British tanks actually in the Battle of Java were relocated. They were tanks that were on their way to Singapore, but Singapore fell more quickly than the tanks were able to be delivered there, so they were actually diverted to the island of Java to help in the defense there. The defense of Java, as I've mentioned in kind of the previous videos about the Battle of Java Sea, was really a polyglot group of forces. Essentially, you know, you had the Australians, you had the British, you had the Netherlands, you had the Americans, and then even amongst the Netherlands troops, you had kind of colonial and non-colonial troops. So the bulk of the Dutch troops on the Dutch East Indies were not actually from the Netherlands. They were indigenous soldiers that were armed by the Dutch. Interestingly enough, the Dutch actually equipped their soldiers very well. The troops had very high quality equipment. As you can see there, those tank units just absolutely ripped apart our armored units here, and the British are doing more of the same. The Dutch had very quality equipment. Their main failing was they didn't have training that would allow them to deal with the highly professional Japanese military force at this time. The Japanese, by 1942, were one of the most experienced militaries in the world. The Dutch fought briefly in 1940 against the Germans. Not sure how many, if any, of the troops who were defeated there made their way to the Dutch East Indies, but the Dutch fought briefly against the Germans over a couple of weeks, and other than that, you know, they had some colonial military experience, but very little actual combat experience anytime recently. You know, they weren't in World War I either. So they had very little combat experience in any kind of modern combat against a modern enemy. And when you compare that with the Japanese, who had been fighting constantly against a fairly modern or modernizing China since the 1930s, the mid-1930s, this is a Japanese military which had been at war for longer than the United States would be at war during the entire Second World War by the time 1942 rolls around. So again, a very, very professional, very modern, very well-trained Japanese military. And that's the situation in 1940. But one thing I found interesting, and I hate using Wikipedia as a source because it's a really cool thing to be able to just look up and say, oh yeah, what's this? Let's look it up. Oh, cool. And, you know, find information really quick. But when it comes to actual, you know, if you're trying to teach people history, you gotta shy away from sources like Wikipedia unless they've got a really reliable source as their background. Not because Wikipedia is wrong most of the time. I remember when I was in college about 5 years ago reading a study that said Wikipedia was actually very, very close to being as accurate as the Encyclopedia Britannica on a lot of topics. It was very clear, the article was saying, on most topics. There are obviously certain topics. If you exclude, you know, if you take your research and you say, well, we're just gonna take out these 100 different topics and now it's just as accurate, well, you can keep doing that until you get down to the result you want to have. So I'm not sure how useful saying that is, because, well, yeah, sure, you take out some topics, but you can take out all the topics except one if you want to do that. Anyway, that aside, Wikipedia is something I generally shy away from when you're trying to teach people, because you want to make sure what you're teaching is absolutely accurate. And while it's a great resource for, you know, the internet age to be able to just look something up and have an answer, and generally a pretty reliable answer, this actual example is a good reason that you gotta be careful what you look at. I was looking through there, and most of my videos, for what it's worth, are not based on Wikipedia sources, but in this case I was kind of curious, and I don't have any good sources on the Dutch defensive forces on the island of Java during this time period. Nothing in my personal collection in a way of books, which is pretty light on the topic. I've got a book about the Battle of Java Sea with regards to the USS Houston's involvement, and that's about it. And then Silent Victory, which references a lot of this stuff obliquely. But anyway, what I'm getting at so long-windedly is that according to Wikipedia, the Dutch had about 25,000 Dutch troops on the island of Java. The Japanese invaded with about 35,000 infantry. So you'd say, well, that's a healthy advantage for the Japanese, pretty substantial advantage. Although, again, defender on defensive ground should be able to probably put up a reasonably strong fight against that size of a force. But the Dutch also had assistance from the British, and where Wikipedia kind of comes in a little bit uncertain is on one aspect of the page it says the British brought in about 5,500 troops. On the other part of the page it said 3,000. So, not the end of the world. There's obviously a discrepancy there, and maybe someone updated the page and didn't think to update the sidebar where the result, where that other number was, but still, it's kind of like, well, which number do you take? Which one do you know? And I thought it was interesting anyway, so that's kind of my one aside about Wikipedia. But I thought it was interesting that the Dutch had about 25,000 troops, most of them locals, most of them kind of colonials, but they were extremely well equipped, just very poorly trained. In addition to those 25,000 men, however, there were the 5,000, if we give the higher figure credence. There were about 5,000 British troops on the island of Java. There were about 3,000 Australian troops and over 750 American troops. When you take all the numbers and add them together, they're within 1,000 of what the Japanese landed on the island of Java with. So, logically, if you're on the defensive and you're only outnumbered by one, it's 31 or 35 to 34 for every 35 men the enemy have, you have 34. That's basically even. You're fighting almost with even odds. The Dutch had very high quality equipment. Their armor was very good. The British had high quality equipment as well. This was not a ragtag force, but the main problem came down to the fact that of the Dutch troops, the 25,000 troops, largely being locals, were very poorly trained and ended up costing the Dutch. You would think, again, Japanese naval supremacy certainly would doom the island eventually. It would fall. But the main issue that I think speaks to the perhaps valiant but inadequate training was the fact that the Japanese landed on March 1st of 1942, and within about a week, by March 8th, the defenders of the island had been totally overrun, and the island surrendered. Now, it's true the Japanese hadn't occupied every part of the island yet. It was just more or less a situation where the Dutch saw that the defeat was inevitable, and so they decided to surrender prior to everything being defeated. And it's also true that despite the fact that they had near parity in numbers, the defeat on the high seas at the Battle of Java Sea ensured that the island would be cut off from supply, and that long-term, nothing but defeat was likely. And it's also true that as the defenders of a long, stretched-out island, these forces, while somewhat almost in parity with the Japanese in terms of numbers, had a much larger front they had to defend against possible invasions, and the Japanese did land at multiple points. Nonetheless, the fact that only a week of resistance was able to be put up before it was determined that it was time to surrender is a little bit telling that the defensive forces were in a large degree of disarray. Certainly the Japanese control of the skies and seas didn't help matters, but still you would think two armies on a very large island, for that matter, would be able to put up more than a week of resistance in that situation. Most of the troops that were on the islands were surrendered. Very few were able to be evacuated out. Some of the air units were able to be evacuated out, along with certain personnel. Some submarines carried out some men as well. U.S. submarines had been providing that role on Corregidor. I think it's interesting as well when you look at the Battle of Java to consider the fact that a large and key portion of the Japanese invasion force, the 48th Division, had actually been pulled off of the Philippines because they believed that the troops in Bataan and Corregidor, that area, had already been defeated, and they had started pulling troops out before the final attacks down the Bataan Peninsula. The Japanese perhaps over anticipated or over exaggerated the degree with which the Americans had been defeated. They still ended up putting up some more resistance for a couple more weeks, and then the island of Corregidor ended up resisting into May, I believe, early May, like May 1st or 2nd. Beyond, not when the Japanese invaded Java, but beyond when the Japanese started withdrawing their troops out of the Philippines. Wondered what a more effective defense of the island of the Philippines would look like. Clay Blair, in his book Silent Victory, which is about the American submarine war in the Pacific, makes the claim that if the U.S. had used their subs skillfully, goodness, I can't speak, if the Americans had used their subs skillfully, and if they weren't undercut by ineffective torpedoes, they may have been able to stop the invasion of the Philippines altogether. I find that pretty unlikely. The idea that 20 submarines with a relatively small torpedo supply is going to be able to stop an invasion of tens of thousands of soldiers with dozens and dozens of warships, to me seems a little bit far-fetched. I suppose it's possible if everything goes right. Yeah, maybe. But, I guess war is filled with what-ifs. Sure, if they had the perfect strategy with a perfect group of commanders with perfect torpedoes, maybe everything goes right and they inflict critical losses on the Japanese and totally defeat them. But again, with the location of where the Philippines was, with the Japanese dominance of the air off Formosa, and with the Japanese ability to bring in carrier battle groups as well to dominate the seas, it's highly unlikely that, in my opinion, that the Philippines had any chance. And once the Philippines fell, those forces were brought to bear against the Dutch East Indies and the Malay barrier, which, despite their distance from Japan, were far less prepared and able to resist in any kind of meaningful way than, I would say, probably the British troops in Singapore or the American troops in the Philippines. They certainly put up a brave fight when they were fighting, but again, the Dutch just weren't in a situation where they had the type of equipment, experience, personnel, and budget to resist the Japanese Empire at this time. The Americans weren't prepared for a war either, but they were their troops had been preparing longer as a combined force. The Filipino troops had been operating longer with the Americans, and the Americans had more recent warfare experience in World War I, the British as well, and in general the troops were well equipped also. Not trying to sell the Dutch short or anything, just a fact that the British and the Americans had fought many more wars, had a lot more experience, a lot larger military bases to draw from, better logistics, better navies to draw from. In essence, they were much more able to support a war in a far-off land than the Dutch were, especially also considering the fact that the Dutch homelands were all occupied by the Nazis or the Germans, and there's that aspect as well. But anyway, this video, I feel like I've kind of talked a lot about nothing, and for that I apologize. That certainly wasn't my intent. My intent was to make sure that this video had many historical discussions as usual. Not always, sometimes I just talk about what I'm doing on the map, but you can see obviously we've taken the airfield in the east, but we haven't won yet. So that's one other critical aspect. Is the other objective, which I was neglecting to mention, was the fact that I need to destroy enemy trucks. We still need to destroy a couple more enemy trucks in order to be successful and win this battle. The Dutch launched a very successful counterattack against us here in our central area, where they've driven a wedge all the way back to that bridge line. But we still have that road up near the coast ever so critically, which is able to provide supplies down to our troops in the Far East. And the Dutch are being annoying here in the central area of the map. Fortunately, things are going a little bit better in the south, so we'll continue our advance on whatever that final Dutch city is down there with all those cargo trucks. But that's where we're at. We've taken all our objective cities. We just need to destroy these cargo trucks, which I think is a little bit frustrating and gamey, personally. The idea of Japan not taking and winning this battle already, because the Dutch still have some obscure trucks located somewhere, seems a little bit far-fetched to me. But hey, it is what it is. Anyway, guys, that's going to about do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know in the comments. If you didn't, let me know in the comments. And also let me know what you'd like to see in the future. But until next time, this is the Historical Gamer saying thank you for watching, and I'm out.